Welcome back. You're watching Australian Agenda. Troy Bramston, Paul Kelly and I have just been speaking to the Trade Minister, Andrew Robb, and we're joined now live in the studio by the head of the Transport Workers Union, Tony Sheldon. Welcome to the program.
Good morning.
Can I start off the back of all this talk about free trade and the deal with China? What's your view on this? Are you in favour of it, or are you fundamentally concerned?
Well, I think we should all be fundamentally concerned about the free trade agreement on some key elements. Is it what's happening for Australian jobs? How are we generating employment for the future? And why have we agreed to bringing Chinese labour in at lower rates of pay? Because the government has said in the north of this country that wages will be reduced for imported labour by 10%. That's well below the market rates for Australians, which means it disincentivises companies from employing Australians. Secondly, the government has turned around and said that they're freezing the payments for imported labour across the country for the next 2 years.
Just as a quick follow-up on that, though, before we move on, does that mean that you will be encouraging Labor to not make this bipartisan? Because Andrew Robb was talking about whether or not Labor comes on board. If they don't, of course, this thing could be killed off.
Look, I'll argue right across the community, and that is that a free trade agreement should be judged by Parliament, it should be judged by the community, it shouldn't be a bureaucratic document that's carried out behind closed doors.
But are you saying you want Labor, you want the Parliamentary Labor Party to vote against this?
I believe that this trade agreement doesn't turn around and look after the Australian public, if it doesn't turn around and provide Australian jobs in where we're importing labour that could otherwise be carried out by young Australians, when we're seeing unemployment going up, then every politician has a responsibility to vote against it. And
do you think that's a widely shared view within the trade union movement?
I think many within the broad community have that view, including the trade union movement, that a trade agreement is not just about making sure that the financial institutions can now get into China. It's not just about where mining companies can now import labour from overseas to do Australians' jobs and then also be able to have investments further in China. It's not about private companies and education now getting access to Chinese markets. All that adds up to no improvement for Australians in getting jobs.
But just to clarify this, are you actually saying, I mean the government denies this, but are you actually saying that you think one of the principal arguments against the FTA is that it means cheap Chinese labour?
Absolutely, because the government has said very clearly, both in that trade agreement and the South Korean trade agreement, and potentially in the Pacific trade agreements, that they're saying that the capacity to bring in cheap labour from overseas when they have frozen the wages for imported labour for the next 2 years, and they've said in the north of the country there'll be a 10% reduction. That means Australian jobs are sacrificed and the Australian community is losing out.
Mr Sheldon, just moving to other issues.